But popping on our screen first is the conference convener, Dr. Dominic McHugh.
Hey, Jeff, I think you can start chatting if you're ready.
Okay, very good. I'm honored to sort of host this discussion of recently published books. We have 6 authors with us, all of whom who have published important, interesting books in the past year. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling that books have been both a comfort and a stimulus over the past year, and enjoying the silver lining during the pandemic of greater digital access as well. As I look around my workspace, I have been increasingly confined to a space where books are getting closer and closer around me, many of which are by the authors with us here and others in the conference this week. So I'm really pleased to be part of this this talk. I have we only have 30 minutes and we have 6 authors. And so I have written in advance to everyone with some questions to think about to address in a very brief elevator pitch, if you will. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So I urge you to follow up with questions that have not been addressed in the Q&A, and we'll go from there. First, we're going to start with 2 of our 6 members who have not otherwise been in the conference, Shana Redmond and Ellen Peck. And I'm going to start with Shana, who wrote a book on Paul Robeson, Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson with Duke University Press. And Shana, could you start by talking about what significant takeaway you would like the reader to bring to your research, your book?
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this panel. Very quickly, I think there are a number of them, but the 2 that I would draw out are first that, that the state failed. So anyone who knows Paul Robeson's story knows that he was a hunted man throughout much of his career due to his political beliefs. And this happened on both sides of the Atlantic, that he was surveilled and followed. And one of the things that was really important for me to draw out are all of the ways in which he returns to us through the efforts of people's movements, through the efforts of artists and intellectuals. And so to really draw out the fact that the state's efforts to detain and erase this person, which was vigilant and was coordinated, nonetheless failed. And I think that's really important to draw out. And they failed in large part because they failed to take seriously his greatest talent, his superpower, which was his voice. And then secondly, the thing I would want to point out just stylistically is that we have to, as music scholars, as people invested in bringing some kind of sonic facility to the reading practices of our audiences, have to take a lot of care with our writing. I was forced to write differently in order to bring this project to light, and whether or not I'm successful is perhaps up to some others to decide, but I think that the investment in being vulnerable in our writing practice and also incredibly flexible and curious still, no matter what stage of our careers, was really important for me in this project.
Well, thank you very much. So we're going to turn to Ellen Peck. Could you answer the same question, Ellen, with regard to your book, Sweet Mystery, the Musical Works of Rita Johnson Young?
Absolutely. Thank you also for inviting me to be on this panel. Sweet Mystery looks at the playwright, lyricist, librettist Rita Johnson Young, who died in 1926. She was extremely prolific and very well known in her time. She is responsible for some of the most famous songs of the era, including Sweet Mystery of Life, which is from the operetta Naughty Marietta. And she also wrote the lyrics and libretto for Maytime, and many other significant operettas and musical comedies at the beginning of the 20th century. She worked with some of the biggest names in the business, Victor Herbert, Sigmund Romberg, et cetera, and was very well known in her time. She was sought after. She did a lot of shows for the Schuberts. And she just, as with many women of the era, has been sort of relegated to the footnotes. And when I learned about her while I was at the University of Illinois, I was surprised and dismayed at how much she and the other women of her era just they were sort of mentioned, next to the names of the composers they worked with, but nobody ever actually looked at their work and dug in and said, well, what were their writing voices? Who were these women? How did they approach their work? And Rita specifically for me just was a really fascinating character. So, and she gave a lot of interviews and talked a lot about her process. And I just found her delightful, and I wanted to learn more about her. And also, one of the things that you had asked us to consider, Jeff, was, what are some of the takeaways that we would want our readers to get from our books? And for me, the importance of archival work, looking at original scripts, looking at original documents, because they will dismantle some of the assumptions that we've made, some of the long-held preconceptions about writing in the era and about the nature of integration. And that's something that I touch on really quickly in my book. So that just reading her original scripts opened up so much to me about the nature of shows in that period. And it is such an understudied period of time.
Yeah, it's sources that help us tell stories that have remained untold seems to be a theme, doesn't it? Let's turn to Megan Woller, who will talk to us about From Camelot to Spamalot, musical retellings of Arthurian legend on stage and screen. Megan?
Thank you. And I echo everyone else. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to talk about my work with this incredible group of scholars. So my book talks about musical adaptations of Arthurian legend. And I think Arthurian legend is so rich for exploring a lot of different issues. And so I think one of the major takeaways that I would hope that readers could get actually has to do with the exploration of adaptation, and really thinking about, because Arthurian legend is so many hundreds of years old and has so many versions and stories, it provides such a great way to get into some of these issues. And so looking at the possibilities for exploring intertextuality in works is one really major takeaway that I would love people to get from this. And also, because I'm obviously looking specifically at musical versions, how song shapes interpretations and how we understand what can be very familiar characters, expand, deepen, even change how audiences experience these characters.
Thank you. I muted myself and forgot to unmute. So much of our work, it engages with how texts interact with other texts, right? And you've brought that to the foreground. Let's turn now to Julianne Lindberg and her book, Pal Joey, The History of a Heel. Julianne?
Yeah, thank you so much. And just like everyone else, I really appreciate being part of this really amazing group of researchers talking about our work. So Pal Joey, The History of a Heel, it's a biography of a musical. It really is looking at the legacy and cultural history of the show. The show has been such a central part of discussions related to a lot of what we've been talking about this week. ideas related to theatrical maturity, and is considered one of these sort of early golden age works. It was canonized by people like Lehman Engel and others who were interested in the process of canonization in musical theater. So I think that's a really important and interesting part of its history. But I also find it a really fascinating piece of cultural history, particularly its commentary on class and American anxieties related to class in the late years of the Depression. So you can really see this, for instance, in the script by novelist John O'Hara, who also is the author of the source material. He was such a keen observer of class. He's like a real treat for historians because the lens that he looks through is so exacting in terms of vernacular and slang, and the way he's locating a lot of these characters in a very particular class position. You could also see this in Rodgers and Hart's send-ups. Most of the songs that get talked about from Pal Joey are Bewitched and I Could Write a Book, which are the standards that have made themselves come into the jazz repertoire, for instance. But with Rodgers and Hart's satirical send-ups like That Terrific Rainbow or Flower Garden of My Heart, just like John O'Hara's use of dialogue, they're such exacting satires related to class. And I was very interested in how this intersects with gender and the way that the woman characters in the show are drawn. And also the way that our lead, Joey, is drawn. He's a womanizing heel, but much of his agency is undercut by his class position. The person in the show that seems to have the most narrative agency is our lead female character, who is a wealthy middle-aged adulterer who is also very sexually commanding and in control of her sexuality, and yet not seen purely as a comic character. So there's a lot of interesting things I think that relate to the social history, how that's expressed both through the script as well as through the music. And getting to the question of you had asked us what's maybe one of the most compelling discoveries we found as we researched these projects. For me, it had a lot to do with the central importance of dance in the show. And so much of the time we talk about these old sort of Broadway dance directors as less developed versions of the choreographers that come later. And I found that Robert Alton in particular, his work is so central to the appeal of the show, to the critical reactions to the show. And then he went on to supervise the production, the revival in 1952. So you can see more of his mark on the musical. So yeah, recovering dance was a very difficult part of the project, but I was able to do a bit of a partial recovery through some notes on dance and also photography and that sort of thing. So
yeah, thanks for that. Reminds me when I've taught musical theater courses, I sometimes have a unit that I call Bad Bad Man from Annie Get Your Gun, and we talk about Pal Joey and Sweeney Todd consecutively. And at the end of it, I ask the class, which protagonist do you least like, Sweeney Todd, the serial murderer, or Pal Joey? And they always go for Joey. And but
yeah.
Then we talk about how dance actually helps to humanize and animate him and strengthen him. And now thank you for that. Let's turn to another author and our host, Dominic McHugh, whose book is poised to be released, I think, according to the website of Oxford University Press, on the 17th. So we're 2 days away. So it's about to happen. And the book is The Big Parade, Meredith Wilson's Musicals from the Music Man to 1491.
It is. And I haven't seen the book yet, but I have friends that have received it and read it. So I feel like I'm in suspense and not entirely able to speak about it. But I share everyone's pleasure of being on the panel. I'm so grateful to you all for joining us. And it really is a privilege to either work with you for the first time, or again, Julianne and Megan, I think you've been to all the conferences that I've hosted. It's so great to see you become first-time authors, and Ellen and Shana, it's great to meet you. And Tim, it's great to be working with you again, and you, Jeff. So Meredith Wilson, I have always loved The Music Man, but the reason why I'm interested in him is because I'm generally interested in these unusual figures that worked in this sort of 1940s, 1950s period on Broadway where they worked across multiple domains. And the more I looked at Wilson, the more I was just struck that he was in Sousa's band for 4 years, and then he was in the New York Philharmonic for 4 years, and played in Stravinsky premieres in America, and in Gershwin premieres, and all kinds of unusual music that we might not associate with him. And then he went and worked as a radio musical director on the West Coast, and then he ended up writing the score to Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator of all films. And he became in charge of the entertainment on the radio for the armed forces during the war. And so he ended up working with all these big Hollywood stars. He wrote a novel, and then he wrote a memoir. And then at the age of 55, he wrote The Music Man, and it was this big hit. And I just became incredibly intrigued at this kind of that this figure could come in and write this big hit, and where did it all come from? And in the end, I decided that his previous life had been a kind of paradigm for the things in The Music Man. I think that he massaged a story around it, and that people have assumed that The Music Man just kind of happened, that it emanated from him. Actually, I think that he actively took various bits and pieces from the different parts of his career and put them into this really unusual show with all its flaws and positives as well. And then it just haunted him. So the rest of his career on Broadway got worse and worse and worse. He was entirely off his time in terms of he was at least an innovator in The Music Man. And then by the end of his career, he wrote a really dreadful show about Christopher Columbus in 1969, and was so out of touch with everything that was going on around him, and not just out of touch, but resistant. And the show rightly flopped. And that intrigued me too, the fact that he could be so celebrated in 1957, and then in 1969 write this last show, and it didn't even make it to Broadway, and that was the end. So I was kind of interested in this whole arc rather than writing about this one show in isolation. And as everyone has said, the use of primary sources and archival materials helped me kind of get into it. And just to finish by thanking the Songbook Foundation again, because I did so much of the research there, because they have the Wilson papers, a really incredible collection.
Excuse me again. Coming full circle to resonate with Kara's keynote, wonderful keynote, we have Tim Carter, who has published a revised and expanded edition of his book, Oklahoma, The Making of an American Musical, which also came out in the past year from Oxford University Press. Tim?
Thank you so much, Jeff, and everyone on the panel. It's a privilege to be here. You'll also discover that publishing a book is a very humbling experience. Authorial arrogance very quickly goes out of the window, especially if you're writing on Broadway, because there are a lot of readers out there who know a lot about the repertory, and they are very happy to send you emails saying, I thought your book was fabulous, but you got this wrong, or you got that wrong, and so on. Another way in which my arrogance, if I had any, very quickly disappeared was in thinking that I had said everything there was to say about Oklahoma. That's, of course, what one thinks when one writes a book. And then one knows that there is always more things to be found. So I had the luxury of doing a revised edition of the Oklahoma book. It came out in 2007. Now a revised edition came out in 2020, where I was able to take advantage of all those corrections from those fabulous readers who sent me emails, but also from archival sources that weren't available to me at the time, but became available, principally the Reuben Mamoulian papers in the Library of Congress. When I was doing the research for the first edition, I had kind of an afternoon in the Library of Congress looking over the papers, being watched over by a curator because the collection hadn't yet been processed, so they weren't really willing to let me ferret through things. But then the collection was indeed processed by the wonderful people at the Library of Congress, and I was able to spend a lot more time. And that gave me a great deal more information on the whole rehearsal and working process of the creation of Oklahoma, basically from the middle of January 1943 up to the opening at the end of March through the tryouts. So I was able to fill out a lot of the gaps. And I was kind of pleased to see that where I'd had to guess things, I got things right about maybe 75% of the time, but the 25% of the time where I got things wrong was really clarified by the Reuben Mamoulian papers and what they were able to show through draft scripts, correspondence, diary entries, and so on. I'm still worried that my book tells everyone more than anyone could possibly want to know about Oklahoma. And this is a kind of obsession of those of us who work in archival documents. You find something and every single nugget of information you find is so absolutely precious that it has to be inserted into footnote 196, even though you've got another 350 footnotes to go. But that's part of the fun of the job we're in, the world we live in. And it also offers hope for the future, I think, because you can never say enough. You can never say everything. There is always going to be more stuff to find out there. And that's something to be celebrated and not regretted in any kind of way. Thank you.
Yes, as I heard an editor once say, in paraphrasing a poet, books are not finished, they're abandoned, right? Thank you all. So far, we have nothing in the Q&A, so let me follow up with oh, here we go. We have something just now. Critics in the 40s really disliked Joey Evans, but more or less turned a blind eye to Billy Bigelow, who actually beat his wife. Can you comment? So we can open that to everyone, but Tim, you can start.
I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I think it varies. The situation is different because of the dates in which these works were performed, and Julianne can maybe talk more about this. Joey is, of course, interesting because Gene Kelly played Joey. So once you have Gene Kelly playing Joey, all sorts of things come into play. And by the time we get to Carousel in 1945, we're getting to the end of World War II. And there's a whole different dynamic coming into play about the acceptability or not of abusive social relationships. And Oscar Hammerstein and Rogers are trying to work this out in Carousel, not very successfully. And Carousel is a very, very problematic musical from that point of view. But when you've got Pal Joey in effect before the war starts, as far as the US is concerned, and then you've got Carousel at the end, you're in a very different social world, a very different cultural world. None of that excuses the problems of either of those shows, but it sets those problems in quite different contexts.
Julianne, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the time period absolutely does matter. And I think some of it has to do with what the sympathy that Joey is not really given by the creators of the show. He's a heel through and through. He has no redemption arc whatsoever. And actually, the John O'Hara's original preliminary script for the show had a bit of a happy ending for Joey and this character Linda at the end of the show, and that was cut out of the show, and it was much more hard-boiled by the end of it. So I think it's because the creators of the show weren't necessarily supporting that, except in so much as him being sort of superficially charming. He was obviously Gene Kelly, the dance, all of that. But in the end, he doesn't have a lot of depth to his character. One of the major cuts to the show was a song called I'm Talking to My Pal, which would have given more sort of depth to him as a character, but that was also cut. So I think there's also the work of the creators to not necessarily give the audience that that sympathy that Billy Bigelow, for instance, is given by the creators.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Back to Shana. I asked everyone actually to try to identify one or two of the most compelling discoveries you made in the course of your research, and I wonder if you could expand upon what you started with on that question.
I think maybe story specific is most illuminating. So the arc of the book is really trying to trace him in scale and to think about him at his most basic of element at the very beginning and follow him all the way through his marking, his escalation to mountain peak by the end of the book. And this is all generated through my language of antiphonal life, which is how he is called back to us again and again and again, and by which he continues to respond and return in all of these different forms, from the voice on the record to the built and natural environment. And in 1957, during the period of his passport revocation, the US Federal State Department took his passport from 50 to 58. So during this moment, as there's an international campaign waged in order to allow him to travel again, it's titled Let Paul Robeson Sing, was the international campaign. During 1957, he stages a transatlantic concert with the miners of South Wales. And this moment for me, thankfully, which was recorded and preserved, there was a Welsh label that actually produced a recording of this transatlantic concert from which Robeson was recording at his do-it-yourself studio in New York City, because by this point, all labels canceled his contracts and refused to record him, and was received in Porthcawl Pavilion in South Wales. And having been able to go to Wales and spend almost a month there in the archives, in the miners' archives, but also to go to the Porthcawl Pavilion, which is still functioning as a performance space, it was a really important moment for me of both kind of merging this textual analysis with the kind of experiential elements of having been in the space, having listened in the space, that I can only, based on my long listening practice and my archival work, kind of imagine the trace of his voice in the dome of the pavilion or in the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where I also visited in order to hear the boys' choir as an effort to be where he was, and to try and settle and wrestle with the ways in which people today still hear his voice in these spaces, or desire to hear his voice in these spaces, and what kind of social and political and artistic work that those traces still perform. So those were the kinds of some of the mergers that I was trying to work through in this project, which is highly experimental. It's not a biography, but I wanted to bring a different type of animation to the story that is not traditionally told of this person.
At the risk of asking the obvious, what was Robeson's biggest transgression that brought the state down upon him for so long?
I think it was all the combination of really his anti-colonial work, his drawing attention to colonization, particularly on the continent of Africa, but also his demands and insistence around a movement toward socialism. But of course, it was the Red Scare that made possible the types of fantastic surveillance and accusation that he faced. So McCarthyism having been really the driving political force for this period of rupture.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Michael Garber. To all, to what extent are the young being taught or just learning on their own about Robeson, the children, teens, high schoolers, undergrads? I don't know if that was part of your study, really. Shana, if you could start.
Sure. I think there are a couple ways in which he returns. There are actually a number of elementary and middle schools that are named for him across the country, which is an interesting move. This is, again, the built environment in which he appears. But quite often what I've learned from people is that his image may hang in the hallway, but they actually don't know who he is. So there's a recognition that's still an illusion in many cases, where people still don't know who he was, in part because the apparatus around him has disintegrated due to force. But I think, we're at a musicals conference, right? Showboat is still one of the ways that people might come to know his name. There was a stamp that was created of his image early in the 21st century that may have circulated to some extent. But I think it really is in these kind of calcified moments of pause that it's in these moments of the Showboat film version, for example, that he's frozen in time. And if you know his name, that may be the singular way in which you know him, which of course obscures so much of who he actually was.
Thank you. So to the question of, exciting, compelling discoveries, I wonder if we could turn to other panelists. Ellen, would you be able to identify something you discovered that really kind of shone a new light on your work and what you were trying to do?
Sure. I mean, there were a lot of things. I think one that jumps to mind. One of the big challenges with Rita Johnson Young was, as I said, I had to look at a lot of archival materials and a lot of unpublished manuscript scripts. And she did several collaborations where she was the one of two lyricist librettists on a project. And I thought it would be harder to distinguish her voice from her partners. What I found, there were two shows where the stars were allowed to interpolate some of their own material. And I was so frustrated because their writing was so bad in comparison to hers. And seeing how a musical changed once a star was brought on and was allowed to change the work that she had done. But I think, but it was also a reminder of one of the practices of the time was that a star could wield a lot of power, and producers would defer to the stars if that was going to, put butts in the seats. And so I think just seeing how a script could change once there was a specific influence, and alter, the work of one of the collaborators.
We are almost out of time, but I can't resist repeating Hannah Robbins' question. What is one thing you wanted to include but had to leave out? And I'm afraid we're going to probably have to leave out your answers to those questions, as I'm getting the signal that we're about out of time. Is that correct, Dominic?
I'm afraid so. I'm so sorry, everyone. We could carry this on for another hour.
We could, couldn't we? So I just, I hope this has at least given everyone present a taste of these wonderful books and a desire to read them if you haven't read them already. I feel honored to be in this company here today, and thank everyone for being here. Thank for the authors for